Hello, my name is Martin Hernandez. I'm one of the regional outreach managers with the Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota. Thank you for joining us for the Seizure Smart training. This presentation should be about 45 minutes long. The objectives for this presentation, what I hope you can all get out of this, first and foremost, the ability to define exactly what is epilepsy and what are seizures. We'd want to be able to identify the 4 leading types of seizures, know and learn the appropriate responses should we encounter someone who is having a seizure, and then finally increasing our knowledge base of available treatment options. So to start off, what is epilepsy? Epilepsy is a neurological condition characterized by unprovoked and recurrent seizures. The key words to take away from the definition, neurological, so it is something having to do with the brain or the person's neurological system. Unprovoked, so these are seizures that are happening not due to another medical condition. I'll go into these a little bit more further on, but people can have febrile seizures, seizures from having a high fever, as well as withdrawal seizures. Any sort of high level of stress can induce a seizure. In folks with epilepsy, this is not happening for any one of those reasons. It is occurring, again, unprovoked. And finally, recurrent. So they are not just having one. Again, with those other types of seizures, they will usually just be one. With epilepsy, they are having multiple seizures. You may hear terms such as seizure disorder or a seizure condition. These are terms that have been used at times to describe epilepsy. However, at EFMN, we recommend using the term epilepsy as it is the most correct term for this condition. A few key epilepsy facts to know. Epilepsy is not contagious, so it is not caused by any sort of bacteria or contagion. It is a physical disorder occurring within the person's brain. Epilepsy is not classified as a mental illness, so it is not a mental illness like depression or anxiety. We know that there are people with epilepsy who can also have anxiety or depression. However, they are not the same thing. Epilepsy is a neurological disorder. Epilepsy exists on a spectrum, a pretty wide spectrum. You can have 2 people, both of whom have a diagnosis of epilepsy. One who has been on a single medication, and this medication has allowed them to be seizure-free for several years now. On the other hand, you may have someone who has been on multiple medications, who is still having seizures, perhaps daily, perhaps on a weekly basis. Their seizures are not under control. And because their seizures are not under control, they are unable to drive, they are unable to hold certain types of work. And so that's just an extreme example of 2 different people, both of whom would have epilepsy. However, their lived experiences would be completely different because of the way that the epilepsy has manifested itself in their condition. And finally, people will rarely die from having epilepsy. We'll go into a little later a couple instances in which there is a risk for death occurring. However, it is extremely rare, and people rarely die from having a seizure. So the current prevalence of epilepsy, we know that 1 in 26 people will develop epilepsy at some point in their lifetime. About 1 in every 10 people will have a seizure. And the discrepancy in those numbers, again, is there are more people having these one-off seizures, these singular seizures that are not necessarily caused by epilepsy. But again, anyone, if at any point they exceed their seizure threshold due to some undue stress, then they can have a seizure as well. We have approximately 54,000 people living in Minnesota who currently have epilepsy. And each year, In the United States, we see approximately 200,000 new cases of epilepsy and seizure disorders being diagnosed. Epilepsy is the fourth most common neurological condition after migraines, stroke, and Alzheimer's disease. We see epilepsy as the leading brain condition in children as well. About a third of the people with epilepsy live with uncontrolled seizures, and adults with epilepsy are more likely to have 4 or more co-occurring chronic conditions. Some additional statistics for the United States. We see people with low economic status being 2 to 4 times more likely to have a seizure. We see that African Americans and Hispanics are nearly 40% of persons who are diagnosed with epilepsy. About a third of the children who live with epilepsy live in food insecure homes. And about half of the adults who are living with active epilepsy have an annual family income, which averages is less than $25,000 a year. Looking at the leading causes for epilepsy, again, remembering that it is a neurological condition occurring within the person's brain. You see on this list, brain infection, a brain injury at birth, a change in a person's brain development, a brain lesion or a brain tumor. After someone has had one of these, they may develop epilepsy. Same with an injury to the head, or if a person has had a stroke. Anything that causes some sort of damage or can change the brain in a way can lead to the person then developing epilepsy. However, the most common cause that we see, and the leading one down on the bottom right, about 60 to 70% of people, the cause will be unknown. This can be for several reasons. It's possible that the medical technology we have right now isn't able to pinpoint exactly where in the brain the seizure is occurring. Say someone had an injury to the head and years has passed before they started to notice that they have epilepsy. The doctors may not be able to pinpoint exactly what injury then led to the person developing epilepsy. And so again, for 60 to 70% of people, the cause will be unknown. And so now we know what epilepsy is. What is a seizure? Seizures are sudden and involve brief, uncontrolled electrical activity in the brain. We all know that we have electricity in our brain at all times. However, when a seizure occurs, the electricity will spike. There will be too much of it occurring. Seizures can occur with other conditions as well. As I mentioned, there are febrile seizures, which occur in children when they have a high fever. There are withdrawal seizures, which can happen to people if they are undergoing withdrawal from drugs or alcohol. There are also diabetic seizures that can occur when a person either has a disbalance in their insulin or blood sugar levels. Any one of those things can cause a singular seizure to occur, even if it's not necessarily caused by a person's epilepsy. So seizures can occur for a variety of conditions. And the seizure will be displayed differently with the person's body, depending on the area of the brain that is involved. And so when we look at potential seizure triggers, these are really important for a person with epilepsy to know. For some people, they may have one or more triggers. Some people may not necessarily have any known triggers, but it's always something important for someone with epilepsy to know what their triggers are in order to find better control of their seizures, know when they're going to have them, be able to track what is potentially causing them. We see the most common one, of course, being missed or late medication. So if someone is on a regimen and they either miss or are late with taking one of their medications, can throw their balance off, and then that would allow them to have a seizure, even if they were under control before. But anything really that can lower a person's seizure threshold. If someone with epilepsy already has a fairly low seizure threshold, adding additional stress or anxiety, lack of sleep, fatigue, people going through hormonal changes, alcohol, recreational drugs, these can interact with their medication and potentially cause that imbalance again that will allow them to have a seizure. Overheating, dehydration, a poor diet, and missing meals. Again, those can affect a person into having a seizure. And finally, we have photosensitivity. And so this would be a trigger that is caused by flashing lights. That is one that we see very common in movies and television. However, it only affects a small percentage of those who are living with epilepsy. Next, we're going to start looking at the seizure types that we have. Before we go into that, just take a look at the images here. There are two main dividing groups when we look at seizures. There are focal seizures, and then there are generalized seizures. A focal seizure is a seizure, as you can see on the left, the red, let's say that the red part is the seizure. It's happening in one location of the brain. It's spreading out from there, but it's not spreading to the entirety of the brain. It is a focal focused on one point. And then on the right-hand side, you see that brain is having a generalized seizure. So it's occurring across the entirety of the brain. Depending on whether a seizure is focused on one part or whether the seizure is occurring throughout the entire brain, we will see the seizure manifest in different ways. The first type of seizure we're going to talk about is the focal aware seizure. These were formerly known as simple partial seizures. A person having this type of seizure would not have a change in awareness, so they would remain aware during the seizure. However, what they would see as far as changes could be changes in sensation. So they may taste, hear, or smell things that aren't there. Someone observing them may see movements brought on by this type of seizure. So there might be an extension of the arms or legs, a rhythmic tapping of the leg, or the fingers on the desk if they were at school. And then they may also feel extreme emotions. So unexplained fears, joys, confusion, some sort of emotional response to that electrical activity. And again, all of these different sensations, movements, emotions would be triggered depending on where in the brain that focal seizure is happening. We typically see these lasting a few seconds, up to 2 minutes in length. Because the person may not necessarily know that they were having a seizure, and yet they would still be feeling these unexplained emotions. Being there to emotionally reassure the person is key in the response. And I'm going to say this for all types of seizures, always want to document. So timing the seizure from the beginning until the end, and then documenting any changes you see in the person. So if there was that rhythmic movement, if they did tell you afterwards that they heard or smelled something, documenting all that information will be important for them and for their doctors. The next type of seizure is known as a focal impaired awareness seizure. So similar to the last one, it is focal, so occurring in one part of the brain. However, with this type of seizure, we do see awareness being altered. This type of seizure, you may hear it referred to in the past as a complex partial seizure. And again, because the person's awareness is altered, this one will manifest slightly differently than the last one. You would again see some of those repetitive or purposeless movements. However, now there may be a blank stare as well because their awareness is altered and they are not conscious of what is happening during this type of seizure. There may be changes in their speech, so they may not necessarily say anything that may make sense to you because they're not aware of what they're saying. They may be in the middle of a sentence and then trail off as they start to have the seizure, again, because they are losing their awareness of what is going on. Because they are unaware, if we try to restrain a person who is having a focal impaired awareness seizure, their fight or flight response will trigger and activate. And so you could see them potentially lash out, and this can harm both themselves and the person who's trying to help. We typically see these lasting 1 to 3 minutes in length. And I'm going to play a short video clip now. I want you to think as you watch it, how this type of seizure could be confused with other behaviors. And so I hope you saw in that video, the man was walking through the mall, it seemed, when he began to have his focal impaired awareness seizure. He dropped his bag to his side. He stopped walking in the direction he was going and seemed to kind of just pace back and forth in place. His head turned to the side. He started staring off to the ground, started tugging at his shirt. And when the security officer went up to talk to him and ask him a question, he didn't respond. Again, because his awareness was altered, he would not have been able to even register that somebody was speaking to him, let alone respond appropriately. So the appropriate response, if you do encounter someone having this type of seizure, it'll always depend on the individual and the situation, but most importantly, stay calm. You'll want to track the time from the beginning until the end of this type of seizure as well. Remember, you don't want to restrain the person because they may lash out. However, if the seizure is causing them to move into danger, so say you saw someone on the side of a busy road, they're having this type of seizure and moving towards the street, you can gently grab them from behind, guide them using their shoulders away from danger. But again, being careful and deliberate and not necessarily trying to grab them, because then they may strike out of pure instinctual response. And then finally remaining with the person until they have gained full awareness. And so now we're going to talk about two types of generalized seizures. So seizures that are occurring throughout the entirety of the brain. The first one is known as an absence seizure. These were formerly known as petit mal, which means small bad. They are categorized by brief and sudden lapses in a person's awareness. They would show as brief staring and or a rapid facial movement. We typically see them lasting 5 to 20 seconds in length. And there's a quick return to typical awareness following this type of seizure. This type of seizure may be confused with daydreaming or a student having an attention issue. And as with all types of seizures, tracking the time, the duration of the seizure, and documenting any additional effects that happen is always important information that is great to have. Coming up, we're going to see a short video clip of a student who is having this type of seizure.
This girl has absence seizures, and you will see her have one while she's talking.
Because he can be as heavy as ever.
And there's a real blankness, a vacant look in the eye, and then all of a sudden they're right back with you and able to engage.
And so as you saw in that video, the girl was talking to the interviewer when she began to have her absence seizure. And that's when she stared off to the side. And then as she returned to her typical awareness, you see her kind of ask him, where were we? What were we talking about? To reorient herself in the conversation. This is the final type of generalized seizure that we're going to look at today, the generalized tonic-clonic seizure. It is formally known as a grand mal. It is the type of seizure that most people may think of when they hear the word seizure. However, it is not the most common. We typically see this type of seizure have a progression of stages, beginning with a sudden cry or a moan from the person's air being expelled from the lungs as the seizure begins. followed by a loss of consciousness, resulting in a fall. And then the body enters the tonic phase, in which it extends and becomes rigid, before sometimes passing into the clonic phase, in which you would see the rhythmic shaking or jerking of the body, as well as additional effects occurring due to the seizure as well. These typically last 1 to 3 minutes in length. Because of everything that the person's body goes through following this type of seizure, they may feel tired, sore, confused, and may have a headache. Coming up, we'll see a short video clip of another person who is having a generalized tonic-clonic seizure.
They affect the whole brain and the entire body. The tonic phase is the stiffening of the muscles. Then the jerking movements begin, the clonic activity that you see here. A tonic-clonic seizure rarely lasts more than a few minutes. A person having one isn't conscious and won't remember what happened. The skin may become pale. Breathing may seem shallow or labored. Sometimes a child may lose bladder or bowel control or vomit as the seizure ends. These seizures may look painful or even life-threatening.
So one of the things I hope you took note of is that there is also excess saliva and drool that is produced by this type of seizure. And so it's always important to have the person turned over to their side so that can freely flow and they do not choke on it. So the proper response, if you do encounter someone having a generalized tonic-clonic, as always, timing the seizure and documenting it from beginning to end. The beginning would be when the person first loses consciousness, and then ending the timing when their body goes limp and the seizure has ended. You'll want to turn the individual over to their side. Again, this will allow for any drool or saliva that may come out during the seizure to safely fall out with the help of gravity. Because the person will be shaking during the seizure, putting something underneath the person's head, a pillow, a sweater, a jacket, something to cushion their head so that it's not hitting against the hard ground. Removing anything that may get in the way, so any type of clothing or furniture that may be in the person's vicinity, giving them space to have their seizure. And then finally, staying with the person until they are fully aware and have come out of their seizure. Sometimes a person may be able to get right back to their regular activities. And in some cases, they may need a little longer to recover following this type of seizure. It's always important if we have a seizure on the bus to know the appropriate response. And so having a school-wide protocol as to what to do, definitely recommend. The steps for if we do have someone having a seizure on the bus, let the bus driver know so that they can safely pull the bus over and stop, and then keeping the person having the seizure safe from any further injury. If they are having a convulsive seizure, you want to place the student on their side across the seat, facing away from the seat back, or laying them down in the aisle. If it is a non-convulsive type of seizure, you don't have to lay them down on their side. You would just want to stay with them and observe them until the seizure ends. Besides that, following standard seizure response protocol, and then either continuing on to the destination or following the school's policy. If you see someone having a seizure who is in a wheelchair, the appropriate response is to put the wheelchair brakes on to secure them in place. If the wheelchair has a tilt function, you want to tilt the seat back and lock it into position. Leave the person seated with their seatbelt fastened. Support their head until the seizure has ended. And then lean the person slightly over to one side if they were having a convulsive type of seizure, again, to allow for the saliva to escape freely. When to call 911. If a person has a seizure ID bracelet or their history of seizures is already known, you may not always need to call 911. However, sometimes where we say that it is always appropriate to call 911, if this is the first time that a person is having a seizure, so if they were not known to have seizures before, this is the first known one that they're having, you want to call an ambulance. If in the course of the seizure, an injury has taken place, so if they fell, hit their head on the desk, call 911. If at any time the person stops breathing, this next one is one of those in which I mentioned earlier that there is, although rare, but that risk of death. If a person enters status epilepticus, which is a seizure that has lasted for longer than 5 minutes, that is dangerous, and you'll want to call 911. If a seizure takes place in water, because you won't know if a person has ingested any amount of water when they began to have their seizure, another situation to call an ambulance. If there's another health condition present, so if a person is pregnant, if they have a known cardiac condition, again, another time to call 911. And of course, if you feel that you can't respond appropriately, definitely call 911. Another one of those rare instances in which death can occur from a seizure is known as SUDEP, sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. Still fairly rare. It is 1 in 1,000 people with epilepsy who will die from SUDEP. And typically we see the risk factors for SUDEP them being higher in people with uncontrolled seizures, people with epilepsy that has begun in childhood, occurring at a young adult age, 20 to 40 years old. If they have had epilepsy for a long time, if they are not taking their medications regularly as prescribed, that can again contribute to them having uncontrolled seizures and lead to that increased risk for SUDEP. And if a person is having uncontrolled seizures at night, that is, those are all risk factors that can lead to a person experiencing death from their epilepsy. Finally, we'll look at some of the most common treatment options. So we know the most common one and the first one that people will try to control their seizures is medication. However, there are also surgical options. So if a person is able to determine exactly what part of the brain the seizures are occurring from, doctors can go in, surgeons can go in and remove the part that is causing the seizures in order to bring their seizures into control. There are also devices that can be implanted into the person's brain that will also allow them greater control of their seizures. There are certain diets, such as the ketogenic diet, through which people have found success in controlling their seizures. And we also know that a lot of people have tried and used medical cannabis and found success with it in controlling their seizures. The bottom 4 options are all usually and most likely done after a person has tried medication and not been able to find success with it, because medication will always be the first option. So it is medication is the primary way in which seizures are controlled. And as I said, it's almost always the first therapy that a doctor will try. Different types of medicines can help with different kinds of seizures and different kinds of epilepsy. About 7 out of 10 people living with epilepsy are able to find control with medication. And as is the case with almost all medications, definitely never stop or change your medication if you are on epilepsy medication without talking to your doctor. We see that the effectiveness for medications does drop though with each additional medication that a person tries. So the likelihood of gaining seizure control is the highest with the person's first medication to gain control with just one type of medication. However, if the person starts trying different combinations of medications or different types altogether, the likelihood of seizure control will decrease for each new medication that is tried. And all of these different medications have different side effects that will vary depending on the individual. But as you see, for about 47% will find control with that first medication. Then that drops to 13% of people finding control with that second medication. And then by the time they get to that third medication, it has dropped to just 1% of people finding control. Some of the additional impacts of epilepsy that I would like you all to consider. There are challenges both for the individual, for their families, and for their caregivers. And so there are emotional, social, and psychological impacts. A person may feel isolated. They may feel stigmatized in society because of their condition. It can have an impact on the person's finances, may make it difficult to find certain types of work because they are unable to drive if they have uncontrolled seizures. That can also lead to isolation as far as keeping someone at home. They may have difficulty acquiring medical insurance. They may have difficulty finding the appropriate healthcare, again, depending on exactly how their epilepsy is and where they live. All of these are factors that need to be taken into consideration as far as the additional impacts of epilepsy on the whole person. We have epilepsy resources that we recommend that people definitely embrace. Having a seizure action plan. If a person has epilepsy, this is a way for them to have on the record, either at work or at school, exactly what type of epilepsy they have, what types of seizures they have, if they have a common type that they have regularly, as well as what medication they take, what emergency medication they take in case they are having an uncontrolled seizure, either at school or at work. So having a seizure action plan, having seizure observation records. So many times a person themselves won't be able to document what their seizures look like. However, a seizure observation record is a good way for teachers, for friends, for family members to write down what the person's seizure looked like. Again, that documenting portion that I mentioned on all types of seizures. There are seizure alert devices. So the watch over on the right, that is a watch that a person can wear that will detect when they are having a seizure, and it will then alert either a friend or a family member that the person is having a seizure. And this can grant them a little more freedom. They can be off on their own a little bit more while still feeling secure that should they have a seizure, someone will be alerted. Tracking a person's seizures, seizuretracker.com is an option for folks to track, again, what their seizures are looking like and when they're occurring. And then finally, because taking your medication regularly and as prescribed is one of the most important ways to bring seizures under control, having a medicine reminder app to remind you when to take your medications. At EFMN, we also offer information services, so you can go to our website anytime. You can give us a call. We offer free one-on-one support to both families living with those affected by epilepsy and those living with epilepsy themselves. We have customized tools and resources on a variety of epilepsy-related topics, as well as plenty of materials that we can send out to schools, to workplaces, or to individuals. Well, thank you so much for having joined me for this presentation. I hope that this was some useful information. Please feel free to reach out to any of us. We will always be happy, more than happy, to follow up with you and provide any additional help or resources that you feel you need. Thank you so much.